Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer where we're going to unpack the hidden social machinery that actually shapes what we consider to be scientific facts. We so often think of science as this perfectly objective lens just looking out at the universe. But as we're about to see, the reality is much more human, way more interactive, and honestly, a lot more fascinating than that.
So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start off by breaking down the myth of pure science, and then look at how ignorance is actively weaponized. From there, we'll explore some real-world cases where the public actually knew better than the experts, check out how activists literally forced their way into the lab to change medical research, and finally look at how deep-rooted societal structures, like gender, secretly write the language of biology. Let's get started.
Section 1. The Pure Science Myth. Science and the Public. To really understand how scientists have historically viewed the public, we've got to talk about something called the deficit model. For a really long time, the scientific community kind of just operated on this core assumption. They believe that when the public pushes back against a scientific consensus, well, it's simply because the public is deficient in knowledge. They're just empty vessels that need to be filled up with top-down didactic education. In this view, any opposition is just pure ignorance that needs correcting. Now, what's really interesting about this is how we contrast that old way of thinking with reality. Historically, the dominant model told us that science produces pure, unpolluted truth, and any attempt to simplify it for everyday people is basically a distortion. But Science and Technology Studies, or STS, proposes a totally different model. It argues that scientific knowledge doesn't just fall perfectly formed from the sky. It's socially constructed, heavily dependent on its context, and it's constantly interacting with the messy real world.
And to prove that the public isn't just an empty, passive vessel, take the 2004 Hwang Woo-suk affair in South Korea. Hwang was a national hero who published these groundbreaking but ultimately faked stem cell data papers. When investigative journalists actually uncovered the fraud, get this, the public didn't just passively accept the new facts. Instead, massive public rallies were organized to defend him. Women even continued volunteering to donate eggs for his research. It brilliantly illustrates that the public doesn't just quietly consume science, we emotionally invest in its narratives and we fiercely defend them.
Moving on to Section 2. Weaponizing ignorance. The power to manufacture doubt.
This brings us to a fascinating, if slightly unsettling concept, agnotology. It's the systematic study of ignorance, but it goes way beyond just not knowing things. Agnotology reveals how doubt and uncertainty can be strategically manufactured and deployed as a resource. Ignorance isn't always a natural state, Sometimes it is a highly engineered product.
And there is absolutely no better illustration of this than the infamous internal slogan used by the tobacco industry. Doubt is our product. When the scientific evidence linking smoking to cancer became nearly incontrovertible, the industry didn't try to prove smoking was completely safe. That wouldn't work. Instead, they pioneered a strategy of funding counter-research, simply to keep the scientific consensus looking uncertain. They manufactured doubt just to stall action.
And those tactics definitely didn't end with tobacco. According to the source material, veterans of those exact same lobbying efforts utilized identical strategies in the 1990s regarding climate change. By funding select critics who stood just outside the broader consensus, they made the science appear unsettled to the public eye. Once again, the goal wasn't necessarily to definitively prove the science wrong, it was just to manufacture enough ignorance and doubt to effectively paralyze public policy.
Section 3. When the public knows best. The limits of the lab.
Let's set the scene here. April 1986. The radioactive cloud from Chernobyl passes over Britain, dumping radiation on the Cumbrian hills. Government scientists confidently told local sheep farmers not to worry, assuming the radiation would quickly sink into the soil. But by mid-June, they had to suddenly ban all sheep movement. It actually took the government scientists 2 full years to realize their assumptions about the local soil were totally wrong.
The farmers, however, they had been skeptical from day one. And their skepticism wasn't ignorance. It was rooted in deep historical knowledge of how their local soil behaved. When scientists tried to run decontamination experiments by fencing the sheep in, the farmers knew it would fail right away, because they knew sheep just don't thrive in fences. They also knew the grass in the valleys would deplete way too fast. On top of all that, they already distrusted the government due to past cover-ups at a local nuclear plant. Their opposition wasn't irrational. It was deep, highly localized expertise.
This clash perfectly illustrates a concept called civic epistemology. Basically, this term describes how different cultures and communities establish trust and evaluate facts.
The Cumbrian sheep farmers show us that true scientific solutions can't just be dropped from a laboratory on high. They absolutely require understanding local values, addressing historical distrust, and recognizing that local citizens often hold crucial pieces of the scientific puzzle.
Section 4. Activists in the lab. Power to the patients.
Just consider the reaction of a professional biostatistician in the 1980s. He was reviewing a research agenda put together by ACT-UP, the AIDS activist group. And he found himself asking, "You mean we're not doing this? Or we're not doing it this way?" He was totally shocked by the rigor, realizing the activists had incredible ideas the scientific establishment hadn't even considered. In the face of a deadly epidemic, the gay community didn't just wait around for science to save them. They aggressively educated themselves.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the activists took an incredibly smart step-by-step approach. First, they became sophisticated lay experts on virology. Second, they successfully lobbied the FDA for the compassionate use of experimental drugs. Third, and this is critical, they forced clinical trials to drop the use of placebos. Because think about it, in a terminal illness, giving a placebo essentially means requiring a certain number of patients to die just to get baseline data. And fourth, they pushed scientists to allow simultaneous treatments and trials to mimic the messiness of real-world patients. They completely revolutionized how clinical trials are run to this day.
And it wasn't just AIDS activists making waves. The French Muscular Dystrophy Association, or AFM, achieved something super similar. They started out as just a small group of parents and patients, but through massive fundraising success, they transitioned from being passive research subjects into active research directors. They formed these hybrid collectives with scientists, taking the financial and directional reins to organize genetic research based on what the patients actually needed. They literally democratized the science.
Section 5. The Gender of Science. Bias in the Biology.
And this brilliantly illustrates how deep societal influence goes. This bias is glaring when you look at the language historically used in biology textbooks. The sperm was almost always described with active, forceful verbs. It delivers, penetrates, and has velocity. Meanwhile, the egg was described passively. It drifts, is swept, and is just waiting. Scientists were literally projecting 20th century traditional gender stereotypes onto microscopic human cells. The reality, of course, is that both the egg and sperm are highly active participants in fertilization. Our societal biases leaked directly into supposedly objective biology.
So to understand how we fix this, we have to look at standpoint theory. This is the concept that marginalized or oppressed groups actually possess a privileged perspective. Because they have to navigate a world built for the dominant group, they can see societal constraints and biases, like that sperm and egg example, that are completely invisible to the people in power. This is exactly why having diverse, representative laboratories isn't just a matter of social justice. It literally makes the science more objective by removing those hidden biases.
This idea ties closely into what's known as difference feminism, and it's perfectly captured by this quote from Nobel laureate Barbara McClintock. She described her approach to genetics as having a feeling for the organism, an empathetic connection where she felt like she was a part of the system. This drastically contrasts with the traditional, often masculine-coded ideal of science, which historically used metaphors of dominating, dissecting, or controlling nature from a cold, detached distance.
We see this bias clearly in engineering cultures too. Professional cultures very often assign gendered values to different skills. Hard, technical mastery and machine dominance are coded as masculine and highly valued. Meanwhile, soft, social mastery and collaborative methods are coded as feminine and often devalued, even though building any successful technology requires massive amounts of social collaboration. Researchers point out that by arbitrarily valuing the tinkerer over the communicator, these fields actively shape who gets promoted and what technologies actually get built.
So, what does this all mean? The crucial question we arrive at is this. If scientific truth is shaped by the society that creates it, whose voices are missing from the laboratory today? We've explored how ignorance can be manufactured, how local knowledge can outsmart isolated experts, and how sources show activists fighting to remove biases from our textbooks. Remember, you are the public. Your perspective, your local knowledge, and your voice have the power to shape the future of science. Thanks so much for exploring this with me.